Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to this episode of Tristan and the Classics, where I'm going to share with you some personal books, 22 books in fact, that made me the reader I am today. Now I want to say they're not necessarily what I would class the 22 best books I've ever read, although some of those are in here. These are actually books which had such an impact on me. They broadened my horizons to reading. They expanded my understanding of literature and of story and of the arts. And they all had a significant effect which I can still remember to this day. So, having said that, let's start with the 22 books that made me a reader. Oh, by the way, I just want to say two things. I'm not going to rank them because ranking these in order of importance to me is like ranking which stone is more important in the pyramids, you know. They're all necessary. And second of all, I'm not going to give a really in-depth coverage or synopsis of the books because I thought if you're interested, and you'll need to comment down below, maybe I could go through all of these books one at a time in different videos as to why I particularly appreciated them. Right, that said, now let's start with number one. The first book on my list is Jennings at School. I no longer have this book. I had a dilapidated one that just fell apart eventually. But Jennings at School is just one of the many Jennings series of books written by Anthony Buckeridge. And it focuses on the young boy Jennings as he goes into boarding school, makes his friends there, notably Derbyshire, who's this bespectacled young lad with, you know, floppy hair, completely wimpish. You know, he's not athletically inclined at all. In fact, I think he has asthma. And how they form their friendship and try and navigate through the halls of the boarding school with the angry teachers and the school bullies and getting caught doing things they shouldn't and making their plans and their adventures. An absolute wonderful world. Buckeridge designed a great world there, and it just helped me, I remember, begin to think, wow, the stories that are out there. It set my imagination alight. And actually, my mum used to read it to me when I was about 8 or 9 years old. I'd be busy playing, and she'd just read the Anthony Buckeridge books, the Jennings books to me. The second book that assisted me on my journey into becoming an avid reader and really opened my mind up to stories was this beauty, Treasure Island, by Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, this is a copy I picked up in later years because of the illustrations by Robert Ingpen. Just a quick example. I don't know if you can see that down there. He's just a beautiful illustrator. Treasure Island, of course, Jim Hawkins is our main protagonist, and, you know, he's visited, his mum's inn is visited by the captain, who's got, you know, keeps looking out for a man with one leg. And then we get this group of people coming around the inn who seem to be interested in the captain's chest. And then from there, we get the story of a map for Treasure Island, and Jim Hawkins sets sail and he meets Long John Silver and, you know, Israel Hand, who's actually, the name is taken from one of Blackbeard's actual pirate mates. I think he was the gunner. And they set off to find the treasure and all the escapades that go along the way, the incident in the apple barrel, the stockade situation. I remember knowing that this was a brilliantly written book. I loved the story, but I also sensed there was something magnificent in the way the story was crafted. I couldn't explain what it was. I go back now and I appreciate it even more. But this really introduced me to the idea that amongst books, you can love many, many, many books, but amongst books, there really are books that are very well put together. That there is a quality, and just like there's a quality of craftsmanship in any subject, there is also in literature. And this really lit my world on fire. Number 3 is a book that's probably on a lot of people's influential list, and it's Tolkien's The Hobbit. Now, it's easy just to think of this as a children's story, but the more you dig into tales like this, you realise there's not really anything such as a children's story, because this can be enjoyed, as I have many times, as an adult. Why it had a big effect on me the first time reading it was just, it was my introduction to the idea of an epic. You know, built off the age-old poems of the adventurer being called, what we call the hero's quest now, being called to adventure against their will, imparted with abilities, a grand reward at the end. We've got Bilbo Baggins, haven't we? That's pulled by Gandalf and a load of dwarves into going after Smaug's, the dragon's treasure. And all the individual people and elements and trials he meets along the way, such as the ogres and Ariadne's maze, where I believe the number 8 echoes. If you say the word 8, it keeps echoing because of 8 legs. This introduced me to that concept of epic. And I sensed not only the imaginative expanse of the world of Tolkien, but I sensed something very great within my own self begin to expand outwards. Worlds within worlds within worlds. Almost the limitlessness of the worlds within the human being. So that was number 3, The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. The 4th book on my list is a book that I remember still how it took my breath away, how it delighted me, and it opened up the concept of more treasures than all of Aladdin's cave to me. It is Richard III by William Shakespeare. You know I've talked about this before on my channel, and I wouldn't say Richard III is the best Shakespeare play, but what a great character. That base foul stone made precious by the foil of England's chair where he is falsely set, as Richmond would refer to him. I mean, just that as a slight. The way that Shakespeare draws up that slight from Richmond against Richard. The opening lines, "Now is the winter of our discontent, make glorious summer," by this son of York. I remember still when I came to the line right at the end of a horse, my kingdom for a horse. I remember I leapt out of my seat. I was so thrilled with the rhythms, and I didn't even explain it to myself like that. The sheer emotion, the sheer depth of character. Everyone else is pretty 2D around Richard, but Richard himself is a great villain, and yet at the same time, you sort of love him, you root for him, and he's such a larger-than-life, majestic figure, and though a bad guy, and please don't in the comments say it was a hit piece on Richard by the Tudors, just take it for the play itself. Shakespeare constructed a brilliant character, and it absolutely, I did not know you could get such nobility of soul, and such, what's the word, mesmerizing, literally hypnotic effects from a character who holds you out through the pages, grabs you, and you're caught in their thrall. Richard III was my introduction to Shakespeare, and I don't know, was I 12, 13, I don't know, and it was just something else. 5th on my list is a book that made me want to buy a hat with a feather in it and have a sword and gallop on a horse, because the story, once it got going, and I was worried at the beginning because it was quite slow, once it got going, was just the most helter-skelter romance. And by romance, I don't mean love story, I mean the romance, the journey of a character that I'd ever encountered. And again, it introduced me very strongly to the classics and appreciation for them. And it was The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. Now, again, I'm not saying this is the best Dumas book. In fact, just on D'Artagnan, I would say Man in the Iron Mask is better. But Count of Monte Cristo, absolutely superb. However, this was one of my first introductions to the real classics as people think of them. And what an amazing story. We find D'Artagnan early on in life, getting on his old nag horse, trying to make his way into, wants to be respected. He wants to become a musketeer or serve the cardinal's guards. And he wants respect. He's got a high sense of who he is. That impetuous nature, and he gets into, fights with absolutely everybody, meets Athos, Porthos and Aramis, lining them up in successive challenges to duels, and then the story. And it's just a great romp. Dumas just doesn't take his foot off the pedal. And I remember just being bowled along by it, and I wanted to go and live back in the 17th century in France. And it got me into reading a great deal more classic literature. So that was my next one. Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas has a very big place in my heart. In sixth place was another Shakespeare. Obviously blown away by Richard III, I went on a spree of reading Shakespeare's plays, and this one was the very next one, actually. It was Julius Caesar. And again, I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at, as in I understood what I was reading. It took me a bit of practice as well, looking things up. But this highlighted to me just how majestic words are. Already there were great turns of phrase in Richard III, but in here, the conniving and the scheming, the seeing of a good man in Brutus being bent to the will of the conspirators. And then I thought Brutus's speech was very good. And then I read Mark Antony's speech and thought that was just outstanding. I remember reading it over and over and over again. I actually really enjoyed some of the phrases by Julius Caesar himself. I was completely swept up. I found myself transported to ancient Rome. And although there's no details because it's all a play, that's the mark of someone when they can grab hold of you just through words. But I sensed the whole nobility of everybody around about because of that iambic pentameter. And I sensed the humanity within this, where actually time hasn't changed that much. And I began to go back reading this quite a number of times. I went on to Mark Antony and Cleopatra afterwards, which I love, but this was very influential to me. So that's why it's on the list. I could say a lot more about this. You may have noticed that up until this point, apart from number 1, which was the Jennings series, all of these have been based around history. And that's because growing up in the Midlands in England, I was actually in distance of lots and lots of castles, and I loved history, and that always appealed to me. So reading stuff around history also helped. Now, here's where there's a turn, and I remember this significantly at school, and it was the book Pride and Prejudice. I'd watched the BBC drama, I believe, 95, I think it was, and we were supposed to be studying Pride and Prejudice, a book in A-level, but I didn't like it. And I just said to the teacher, could I do something else on my own? And I got assigned Pride and Prejudice. I didn't know what I was in for. And I just began to understand narration. I fell in love with Jane Austen with this book. It seemed so light and simple going along, but the characters made me smile. My appreciation of irony went up, understanding how someone, rather than being sarcastic and obviously ironic in your face, Jane Austen wrote sentences which caused, which were said in all seriousness, but you could sense, hang on, that's not really the case. So situational irony. And then seeing how some of the characters were true to form and yet also satirised. I began to look after this for other books. This book, I would say, was a doorway. It opened up a different avenue of literature to me altogether. I also learned the embodiment of principles and ideas within characters as archetypes. With Darcy and Elizabeth, I first learned through this book to argue against the common attitude of people towards characters. The way people interpreted Darcy and Elizabeth en masse, watching the programme, I totally took the other perspective from them and would reason from the text to make my point. And that was a very significant moment for me. And these characters very much live large in my mind. The 8th book on my list that really had an effect on my reading life is a book I no longer have on my shelves, and the next 3 actually I no longer have. But it was The Face of the Third Reich by Joachim Fest. I was never interested in biography. I loved history. I love people talking about characters in their situation and how they relate to others, but an actual biography was never really my thing. I had read already The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich before reading this book, but I didn't get great amounts from it because I was probably too young. But I was about 17 when I read this book, and Fest gives you a potted biography of the main characters in the Third Reich. So we know Goebbels and Goering and Himmler, you know, the big three, I suppose. But then what about Albert Speer and Martin Bormann and Hess, Rudolf Hess, and various others? I found it fascinating just reading these biographies and then seeing how a knowledge of these independent characters, when I went into other works, when studying the rise of Nazi Germany, I found it remarkable. And so, you know, is it one of the great books to recommend? If you're interested in that time period, I would recommend reading Fest's work, especially the Face of the Third Reich. But it had a big impact on me, and this is just that list of books that had a big impact. So I could talk more about it, but I'm trying to keep the précis short. The 9th book on the list is from one of the greatest writers of all time. And this book blew me away. It's Joy in the Morning by P.G. Wodehouse. Quite specifically, that one. I love loads of P.G. Wodehouse. Joy in the Morning I no longer have because I read it that much. The pages fell out. They just started all dropping out altogether. So I need to get another copy of that. It's a Jeeves and Wooster. Jeeves takes up residence outside a friend's house. You know, Wodehouse writes very similar plot over and over. The skill of his writing is in his turn of phrase. Even if you watch the Jeeves and Wooster programmes, they can never do it justice because it's in the narration that so much of the funny stuff comes out. Joy in the Morning, where he takes up residence in Wee Nook, a little cottage. I won't say any more because I don't want to give away the game of some of the funny set pieces. But it introduced me to Wodehouse, the first character that I ever laughed out loud to in public. I didn't know you could do what he did with language, and it opened my way to all of the Blanding series and the Smith series, and then loads of the others, Uckridge for instance, and Monty Bodkin, for all of those who know what I'm talking about. Now obviously Wodehouse is not someone that everyone's going to like because there's no such author. However, if you've never read P.G. Wodehouse, I do recommend you at least read one. And if I were to select one, well, there's the one that got me in the first place. It was Joy in the Morning. It's a Jeeves and Wooster. At least give it a try. But that, I couldn't believe it. I'd seen Shakespeare do it, but no matter who I'd read since then, no one comes close to being able to turn words like P.G. Wodehouse can. Number 10 on my list might come as a surprise, or maybe you've never even heard of this book, but you'll know the author. I can't even repeat the name of it on here because my video will be flagged. But it's Roald Dahl, and it's one of his short story collections, and it was called Switch, and it's something that rhymes with switch and begins with B. I don't like the word. But I remember reading that story, and Tales of the Unexpected, but this one, Switch B, left me holding my breath at the end. It was a case of the twist in the tale. You know, a story that works along, which was all well and good and very interesting, quite short, and one paragraph at the end. Like, I think it may even have been the last sentence, suddenly made the entire story reframe itself. I remember going, no, I was actually walking when I was reading it. I even remember I was specifically walking over a particular stream on this bridge with a main road to my right. I remember everything because it just... And then as I carried on walking home from where I was, every single piece of the story working backwards started being changed and made me see it in a completely different way. It was for me, and if I went back and read it now, I don't know, maybe I wouldn't be as impressed, but I do remember that got me into the idea of how does an author hide their intentions? How well can it be done? How well can it be disguised? And of course, Roald Dahl was quite well known for doing this. So like I say, the Tales for the Unexpected. And it got me into reading a number of his works, which were thoroughly enjoyable, but that was the one that caught me right at that moment. So there's a moment, singular moment in reading history that I can paint every day. The only thing I don't know is what I was wearing. Can I just interrupt this video to give you a word from our sponsors, which is you, the viewer. If you're enjoying this video, you like this kind of content, you love literature, and you'd like to support my little channel, then you could consider going to my Patreon community where you can get exclusive content about literature and about a particular book which we read every month, which is a list of those. Or if you'd like, you can just make a small contribution on my Buy Me a Coffee page. Everything you give really, really helps me to source my research material, my reading material, and in doing all the research and time it takes to put videos like this together. I really appreciate everything you've done to help me. And now let's get back to this list. The 11th book that significantly altered me as a reader, had an impact on me, opened me to the world of Charles Dickens, and it was Nicholas Nickleby. Again, is it, in my opinion, the best Dickens? No, not by a long way. But it first introduced me to him and gave me such joy and glee and delight. Again, if Woodhouse turned a phrase like no one else, Dickens sketches people like no one else. You know, he is that caricaturist who can draw a person who's immediately recognisable even though all of their features are disproportionate. With Nicholas Nickleby, of course, he's left penniless by his father and turns to his uncle Ralph to help him out, get along in the world. And of course, Ralph is a pretty awful character. And then he goes through life, this Bildungsroman, trying to make his way, trying to look after his sister and his mother, and he gets introduced to all these wonderful characters. The one that stands out to me is Wackford Squeers, the teacher, the headmaster of like a school up north, and it was so well drawn. Later I'd appreciate more of what Dickens was doing as a social commentary, but I remember how he was drawn, everything about him, and I remember grinning over the book. Is it the Mantelinas as well? That's the milliner that Kate works for. The way he drew his characters and his swiftness to sketch out a very vivid and crooked London or city scene was something it bewildered me. I just wanted to take up a pen and start writing myself. And like I say, although not his best, still a great story, but he beautifully captures characters, personalities in just a gesture or the repetition of a gesture or a facial feature. And that's what I absolutely loved about this, and it started my love affair with Charles Dickens. The 12th book that significantly had an impact on me is one we have looked at in my Patreon community. One of the first books we ever looked at when I opened the Patreon community. And that is Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. I found myself quite stirred by this book. I remember reading it and I was enjoying it as it went along. It's all in the first person narrative of Robinson, who tells about his past and how he became rich and then he gets shipwrecked. You know, he'd been a slave himself. And then that detailing of his life on the island alone. And I just began to sense a certain depth. I'd always thought this was just for kids. I'd heard a pared down version as a child. Reading it, I began to feel that exploration of the inner person, of a sense of a book that is trying to get you to focus on what matters in life. It was thought-provoking. And although an exotic setting, it was a principled book. And it gave you that inward thinking of Robinson himself, of weighing up what really matters in life. And by the end of the book, I thought, I think that's what it is. I remember being in my front room when I finished the book, and I remember just staring at the hi-fi system, which was just with its glowing blue digits. And I remember thinking, I want to read more books like this. And I think that's significant. It also was a book that made me go back to try and find out how Defoe had cultivated his character. I began to understand far more about the role of the novel in exploring ideas, and taking you not just on the journey of a story, but causing you to take the story as a mirror to yourself. And so this had a very profound effect on me and my approach to reading other works. It was the book that showed me just how much a work can reveal and how it works as a piece of art. So that was the next one, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. In 13th place, amongst the books that have influenced my reading, is a true great, and it is the Iliad by Homer. I've read other translations before. This one is Alexander Pope's translation. I recommend you use a poetic translation, not a prose, personally, because it's through the poetry, the rhythms, that you get the magnificence, the elevation of spirit, the sense of the muse that's involved. And so this book obviously introduced me to the idea of the real epic. Hobbit gave me that sense of it, but this is a true epic. You know, it magnifies its characters, all these warriors in a 9 days of war, is it 10 days of war outside of Troy? And you've got Tydides, and you've got the great mighty Ajax, and you've got wise Nestor, and you've got Ulysses and Aeneas. And then you've got, of course, Hector, the champion of Troy, and Achilles, this great warrior who is just the best fighter on the planet. He's also the fastest person around. And the thrusting of the armies against each other with the interference of the gods and the fates, it's just wonderful how elevated it becomes. But when you read it in prose, I find it's quite humorous and it's not that spectacular at all. To think of Nestor when he talks about Tydides, oh, truly great, in whom the gods have joined such strength of body with such force of mind. You know, that rhythm as it goes along is kept for everything. And the whole point is to get a sense of honour, esteem, vigour, power, martial prowess, to be great, to be accomplished. You know, it is all about that. And this influences so much of our own mentality towards life. But really, you have to read it and get into it to fully appreciate it. But when I began to appreciate the Iliad, yeah, I understood why it lay right at the foundation of the Western canon. Although I didn't go on to read much more of the Greeks, that has become a recent project. But this one, yeah, what a wonderful, like something else. So 14th on the list takes us back to Shakespeare, and this time it's the one that many of you have been put off Shakespeare by because you were forced to read it at school, and it is Macbeth. Oh my days, Macbeth. Suddenly, I mean, this is, okay, you've got Hamlet and you've got King Lear and all those. This was the first of the 4 big tragedies that I read. And there's something so menacing. It is a bit dark in places. Of course, we've got Macbeth killing Duncan. You've got that idea again, like Iliad, using the fates and everything. You've got that fatalistic nature inside Macbeth, of that prophecy which Macbeth sees the chance to fulfill to become king, but that ultimately is what causes him to die. This great flaw of ambition that crushes him. And you stand at the sidelines completely mesmerized at such a great being ground inexorably by circumstance and time and fate to nothing. Until he just empties himself. His whole body, his whole soul is diminished. But with such rich language. The scheming, the tussling of conscience when he's scheming to kill Duncan. And the way it's laid out in its patterns with such vivid imagery and metaphor and simile and allusion as well to Greek literature and to the Bible specifically. You know, it was so colourful. When I realised after reading that how long it would actually take to just sit and read in one go at normal talking pace, which is what, about 2 hours tops, I couldn't believe it. I felt like I'd been in that world for like months, along with Macbeth. I felt the wind, I felt the aura of the castle, I felt the menace of, you know, the Machiavellian Lady Macbeth and the scheming and the encroaching presence of his enemies who were going to overpower him. I felt it all. I felt like I'd been hung in stasis for some time. And again, although you could say, well, I've already been introduced to Shakespeare, read this one, something else all over. This introduced me really to the idea of grand tragedy. So massively influential in my reading. Love Macbeth. In 15th place is a bit of an unusual one to find on a list like this, but when I was really going over which books I remember, can just remember the effect they had on me and my reading, this one came up and I couldn't avoid it. And it's The Story of Art by E.H. Gombrich. This book sold like millions. And if you want to get into art, the visual arts, I recommend at least getting this book from the library. It is fascinating. Obviously, a lot of literature alludes to music and pieces of the visual arts as well. I like going around and seeing the works of the masters in museums, but I didn't understand so much about it. I sensed there was something there. I've been told there's a lot in art. So I got The Story of Art, and instead of a big thesis on art, it takes you through the ages of art, going back to the ancient Egyptians and the cave paintings. And then moves you through. Now, I didn't read all of it. I skipped sort of to the Renaissance period. And you have lots of illustrations of great pieces of art with an explanation underneath. A bit like Joachim Fest's biography of the Reich masters. You've got small potted histories of some of the painters, but mainly Gombrich gives you a little explanation of the picture and things to look out for. And then as I began reading along through all of it, I began to see patterns that were forming, began to appreciate how much was involved in the craft. Obviously, there's a lot involved, but beginning to see it, it's like having an expert guide take you around a museum and force you to stop and look. And not just to see, it's a picture of two men standing by a table, but to grasp how it's all been constructed, how emotion is being drawn forth, and how those things developed over time up into modern art. One of the things it did for me as a reader, which is what surprised me, was its effect on understanding the power of criticism. Sometimes I used to read books and I'd think, you don't need to read the critics, they're just people who can't write books, so they criticise others. No, they read, or they paint, or they make music. They understand, they listen to it, they read it, they see it, and they think about it. And they find its connections, they find its craft. They find what it's trying to do and where it fails and why it fails and whether it's possible to get hold of what the artist is trying to really get hold of. It highlights what makes real life because art's representing it. It's like looking into the negative space. That book had a very, very profound impact on the way I began thinking about other arts, and it introduced me to reading criticism on literature, strangely enough. And that immeasurably lifted my reading life, like immeasurably so. So that was the next one, The Story of Art by E.H. Gombrich. Now the next one, number 16, might be a bit of a surprise to people watching, and it is J.M. Barrie's Peter, Pan and Wendy, which I also went out and specifically got the Robert Ingpen version with his beautiful illustrations, if that's focused. Peter Pan obviously is classically known as a children's book, and if you buy it, apparently some money goes towards the Great Ormond Street Hospital for children. But instead of thinking of it as a children's book, it's a masterpiece in storytelling, imagination, and wonder. It doesn't matter if you read it as an adult. I've read this multiple times as an adult, and in fact, the first time I read it, I think I was 23 years old, and absolutely delighted me. I felt I was in the presence of someone great. Because it takes such craft to write so simple a story. And yet within that story, really, really are the seeds of all the myths, legends, epics, the fairy tales, the folklore, fables almost. And yet the wonderhood of childhood. With children, we have a natural wonderment, a natural curiosity. And in age, we tend to relegate it to a lesser form. Life is serious. We need to deal with the practicalities. Of course we do. But sometimes that comes at the expense of losing our wonderment. And you read Peter Pan, and it will wake up the child in you. You can't escape it. It is a brilliant piece of work. Again, I'm not trying to give a synopsis of the books here. I may do that in individual videos for every single book. But just on effect of my reading life, at 23 years of age, I read this book and I think, wow, there's so much more to story that I've got to find out. And it made me appreciate just reading for entertainment and for story and good story and what makes it. Yeah, there's a lot I can say about this, but I don't want to keep going on because I've got other books to get through. 17th place would happen to be two books simultaneously, and they're part of the Sherlock Holmes collection. Now, anyone that's in my Patreon group knows that one of them is going to be Study in Scarlet, the opening book which introduces us to Holmes and Watson. The other one is Scandal in Bohemia. Combined, because I think I read them both in the same day, combined they had a tremendous effect on my appreciation. They were just not delightful, they were awe-inspiring. The sheer power of observation that is captured in this book, linked to the simplicity, as in the brevity of the story. That's the remarkable thing. These stories, like Study in Scarlet, what's that, 100 pages? Half of it is the crime, which Sherlock walks in and solves like that, and flawlessly logical as well. And then the second half is how the criminal came to commit the crime in the first place. What was the backstory? Some of the insights that Conan Doyle gives into our ability to look at the world, and the level of thought, I think, is what got me. That Conan Doyle must have sat back and decided he wanted to write this mystery, as it were, but have a completely logical explanation based upon facts which we all would see and yet we all miss because we don't truly look. It's in Scandal in Bohemia where he makes the comment to Watson that you see but you don't look, or you look but you don't see. And the way Conan Doyle brings that to birth in his stories makes you, if you've never read it before, makes you think, right, I'm going to go out and start investigating and try to read people and try to be more observant. And that was significant in my appreciation of reading because I recognised just how much writers are doing and to be far more alert to not just glibly going over a page and thinking, okay, I get what they're saying, but they've put in a lot of observation and I want to see what they see. And they'll teach you to see your real life more fully. It's one of the things I learned from Sherlock, apart from the fact it was just mind-bendingly good. In 18th place is the last of the Shakespeares on this list, and I found this one very moving. I found it tragic, although it was a comedy, and it is The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare. Should really, had it not been for the happy ending, which turns it into the romance or the comedy that it's known to be, and some of the jokes put inside there, this should have been the tragedy of Shylock the Jew. This play, like the great actor Edmund Kean said back in the 17th or 18th century, 18th century, you know, Shylock is the hero in this book. And now he comes off bad. There's all the stereotypes of the Jew in here. But Shakespeare himself doesn't feel like that towards Shylock. In fact, it's a scathing criticism of the Christian society and their narrow-mindedness, their prejudice, their bigotry towards this group of people. But done with such verve. The way Shakespeare never creates a particularly original idea for a story, but the language he uses, he just takes the voice out from the heart, almost without the vocal cords. It just comes out to you and you sense the beings that are involved. And, Portia's great speeches in here, of course. But there's much I can say about it. However, this book had a big impact on me. Because when you go into Shakespeare, you think, well, I've read one, therefore I've discovered Shakespeare. You really haven't. You discover Shakespeare practically in every new play, but this one had quite a dramatic effect on me. It wasn't a history, it wasn't one of the great classic tragedies, and yet I thought he captured life so very well in this particular play, and it sticks with me to this day, like really sticks with me. 19th on my list is a George Orwell book, and it is Animal Farm. You may have thought I was going to bring up 1984. Again, 1984 I would say is better than Animal Farm, but this is about the books that changed me as a reader. Okay, so I've read Aesop's fables and learned, how a story can teach you a moral. I know what allegories are, but I'd never seen it done like this. And again, it helped me appreciate just how much is in that wonderful tapestry we call the art of literature. Because in Animal Farm, the animals throw the humans off Animal Farm, and the pigs set up a bunch of rules because they're clever and they know how to write. There's a bit of a dispute between some of the pigs and one's exiled. And of course, Orwell is pointing at the rise of Stalinism, Stalin's Soviet Union, and how, socialism, which he was in favour of a democratic socialism, but how unchecked it can go horribly wrong. And all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others is the rule that the pigs end up bringing onto the wall. And how people spend their energy, Boxer the horse, for the cause, and yet how they're actually only used by those in power. And I won't give away the end. What got me about this was just an allegory so well written. And because I studied 20th century history and geopolitics, it was quite remarkable that someone can encapsulate in thought, in an idea, so that we stop arguing over one ideology over another. Put it in a story and let the person come to a conclusion themselves. It's so persuasive. That's such a skill. And yeah, it's just, again, when I read it, I remember exactly how I felt at the end of it. I remember exactly where I was when I read it. So there you are, Animal Farm by George Orwell. The 20th book on the list is one I must have lent out because it's not on my shelves anymore. And it is one of Thomas Hardy's works. It's Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Now, I really like Thomas Hardy, but Tess of the D'Urbervilles was just an extraordinary piece of work. I actually do have an in-depth review on that book on my channel. If you look for my playlists on book reviews, I think you'll find Tess there. It was heartrending, but it was how Hardy used suffering and misery, really, to be even-handed across society. It was the exploration of the human condition, but being fair, being even-handed, because often, someone may be of one persuasion ideologically and then blame suffering on the other side. And others on that side may blame suffering on their opponents. You've got at the time of Hardy writing, you've got the clash amongst some over religion and atheism. The book is not about that, but what you do have is the religious element and you have the humanist element. And Tess is caught in the middle. And what Hardy focuses on is that humanity. And Tess is one of my favourite heroines. I suppose that's why this is on my list, is because she looms so large in my mind. When I think suffering, travail, travesty, tragedy, I think of Tess. And if you haven't read it, I really recommend you read. Now, some will say it's a bit of a dark book. I suppose. There's such great moments of beauty. And of course, Hardy as well. He's got this ability to make the human experience and nature sort of symbiotic, or they blur into one. It's this protean form. 1 minute it's nature, then it's embedded in Tess, and then it's back into nature and back into Tess. Absolute genius piece of work. And again, it was a book that I would say left me breathless. And I've read many, many books. I'm not saying Tess is the best book ever, although it's very, very good. but it did leave me breathless, and that's why it's on this list. Down to our last two now. So in 21st place is the other Dickens on this list. Nicholas Nickleby introduced me to Dickens. Great Expectations surprised me no end. What Dickens achieves in Great Expectations, I thought was just moving. And obviously part of this is about personality as well. It was the way Dickens wants you to be Pip. Not to judge Pip, not just to read a story, but to step into his shoes, and he's going to go through life. This is the story, really, of an everyman who goes through life. Now, he does get that amazing benefactor, so he doesn't have to go through the everyman story of just being ordinary. He suddenly spikes into society. But all of his desires, all of his ambitions, all of his presuppositions about what would be a good life to lead, what it means to be a good person, a gentleman, as some people say. And he's typical of Dickens, dotted over with great caricatures who are humours, who symbolise particular traits in human beings or in society, and how Pip is meant to navigate through them. And the drawing up of the scenery, at that moment when he walks into the shambles at Newgate, is a beautiful scene. It's such a clever piece of writing as well, a clever piece of storytelling that's trying to jar you as the reader, because you come to London expecting to see what Pip is expecting to see, but it's not what meets him. And it's just a very clever piece of work, and yet drawn with all the caricature and the humour and fun, and that indescribable sense of what it means to see as a child that Dickens was master at. Perhaps the master, as far as the literature I've read, at capturing, remembering what it is to be a child. This book was wonderful. It wasn't one, how old would I? I'd be 18, 19 when I read this. And it stuck with me through my whole reading life, gone back to it a number of times. So yeah, Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. Which brings us on to the very last one on my list. And again, this is sort of opening my reading experience to a different way of reading, to thinking I've already got relatively deep into things and then finding out there's more levels to go down. And it's about opening up me. I think that's the thing with being a reader. It's those books that are influential are the ones that suddenly make you aware of yourself, aware of more depth within yourself. There may be then greater books which can work on that, but first those depths have got to be recognised before they can be plumbed. And my last one is a book you've probably heard, if you've been following my channel, you've heard me mention many a time, and it is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Raskolnikov's tussle with conscience and tussle with logic, rationality, actually. Of course, Dostoevsky is not irrational, but brute rationality, held up against the hardest thing to hold it up against. Commit a crime which rationally, according to your perspective, should be permissible for the greater good. Does it actually work in the human character? That's pretty much what this book's about. It's slow, it's grueling in places, it's very repetitious. It's masterfully handled. It's got a beautiful balance of different characters to work Raskolnikov against and let him play off. And so as a work of art, it's phenomenal as well. But I remember being drawn in and suddenly realising, wow, this author has got me chewing over a puzzle or an idea that's been around for a long time in our collective conscience, about good and evil, about right and wrong, about rationality, pure rationality and faith. And, you know, it dragged me down with him. I had to start tussling and fighting. And one of my favourite endings ever. I don't like the epilogue, but the original ending is one of my favourite endings ever. And I distinctly remember how I felt when I read this book. Again, I'm not doing a complete review of this. I do have a review. I have 2 videos on Crime and Punishment. So you can go and find those on my channel if you want to. But my point is, this is just the books that have had a significant effect on me as a reader. Again, like I say, it's probably they open up windows to either the world we inhabit, literature as an art, or the many depths that are hidden within us. And these books just unlock them for me. So there you go. I hope you've enjoyed those books. They are all, 22 of those books have had a significant impact on me as a reader. They've changed the way I've gone about things. They've grown me. And would you like me to go through them all more in depth, giving you a synopsis of the whole thing, things that you can take from each book, or at least what I took from each book? Because they're all very, very powerful. I'd have to go back and read them all before doing that, those videos, but that wouldn't be a problem. I'd happily reread all of these. So, okay, they were my 22 books. Which books, leave me in the comments below, which books would you say were massive influences on you? Any at all, from any part in your life. I'd love to hear them down below, and read each other's, because you'll get some great book recommendations from the comments section. Until the next time, I wish you joy in whatever you read.